Thank you, Layla. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. I'm really just here to help kick this off. And so I won't take too long just to welcome you and to say how excited we are on behalf of the ILCN to be hosting our first webinar on conservation in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And I would love to introduce James Levitt, former ILCL director, who is going to be moderating today's webinar. And I've been calling Jim for the past few months our de facto ILCN regional representative for Antarctica. And so it's in that role that he is going to be moderating today's session, which I think will be really fascinating. Just in the planning for this session, I have learned so much. And so I'm sure that you all are just going to want to dive deeper into some really interesting and unique issues and opportunities for conservation in the region. So with that, Jim, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. In my new role as the de facto ILCN representative for Antarctica, I am so happy to be here and to have two people, Claire Christian and Grant Ballard, who are so distinguished in the field. We will try to make Antarctica a focus of our discussions from time to time in this webinar series. And there is so much, such a rich set of topics to discuss. Antarctica is critical to the environmental conditions of all of the rest of the world and is not well understood, I would say, by your average environmentalist resident on the 6 continents on which most people live. So we're very happy to be able to bring these two people to you, Grant Ballard and Claire Christian. And with no further ado, let me first introduce Claire, and then I will introduce Grant after about 25 minutes of Claire's presentation. Claire has worked for ASOC since 2009 and has great expertise on a full range of issues relevant to the Antarctic environment. She aims to educate and inspire people around the world to protect the Antarctic continent and its surrounding ocean, which are some of the world's last great wilderness areas. Claire coordinates policy and strategy related to many of these issues that impact the Antarctic environment, including tourism, fisheries, marine protected areas, and climate change. She is right now sitting in Los Angeles on her way to Hobart, Australia, to participate in the Antarctic and Southern Oceans conference that I believe happens every year. She is an expert on international diplomacy on the environment. Claire, I hand the microphone to you.
Yes, thanks, Jim. I'm on the way to the meeting of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, and you're going to hear that acronym a few times throughout my presentation and Grant's presentation. So yes, they meet for 2 weeks in October every year and make a bunch of decisions about how to conserve Antarctica. But I'll get started on my presentation. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So I'm just going to try to provide a brief overview today. I am happy to take questions if anything is too fast, but I'm also going to try to be brief so that there is time for questions and so that there's plenty of time for us to have a good discussion. So just a quick overview about who we are. We are the Secretariat. ASOC is a coalition. I represent the Secretariat or the headquarters of that coalition. And I will talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk a little bit about how land and sea conservation works in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And I'll also talk about some of the governance challenges that we have there. So first, just about us. We were founded in 1978. There was very little transparency around Antarctic governance at that time. And in fact, there were discussions going on about the possible development of a mining convention. And that would basically be a regulatory framework so that people could do mining and minerals exploration and exploitation. And there were also beginning some discussions about a treaty specifically for the Southern Ocean, because there was a lot of uncontrolled and unregulated fishing going on, and there was concern. Several fishery stocks were already collapsed at this point, and there was concern that there was no international body to manage that. So they were negotiating a new treaty. ASOC found, various NGO environmentalists from around the world found out about these negotiations and started to try to get involved. We were not allowed to participate officially, so we had to find some creative ways to go in. For those of you in the US, you might be interested to know that a lot of this for American NGOs interested in Antarctica was facilitated by President Carter, who had set up citizens advisory councils, and with the aim of making some of these things that the U.S. government was participating in more transparent. And so our founder, Jim Barnes, actually got on one of these advisory councils for the State Department and started to find out about what was going on in the Antarctic Treaty System. And as you can imagine, when environmentalists in the late 1970s found out that countries were negotiating how to mine Antarctica in secret, they thought this was a terrible idea, and they started to get involved. So you can see a picture here on the screen, one of our protests in penguin costumes. We still have penguin costumes, not those, some updated ones, but we started to get public attention around Antarctica and what was going on there and how it was being governed, basically in a closed room by a very small number of countries. So how did we do that? We hung around, besides putting on penguin costumes, we hung around places where we knew that the treaty parties were meeting. We managed to get some folks on government delegations as civil society advisors, and we started to build influence that way. In the late 1980s and 1990s, we were finally allowed to attend these meetings as official observers, and that is still our main function today. We represent pretty much any, not every NGO, but many of the NGOs worldwide that are interested in Antarctic environmental protection, because the Antarctic governance system decided that they only wanted one environmental NGO at their meetings, and so they required that we all come together as one organization to do that. And I want to say required rather than forced, because I think it actually makes us stronger to act as a coalition, because when you're talking about Antarctic governance, you are talking about getting 20-something countries to agree on how to protect the continent and its surrounding Southern Ocean. So you need to have an international network, and I think we're much stronger as a coalition of organizations and interested experts and campaigners from around the world. We're much stronger working together than we would be if there were multiple different observer organizations pursuing different policies. So sometimes it's difficult to get us all to agree on what we want to do, but I think it's worth it in the end, because we really speak with a unified voice, and that's very powerful. We have about 20 member organizations, and like I mentioned, a number of campaigners today, all around the world: Korea, Argentina, Chile, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So we're really proud of being a strong international network, and we really have a lot of amazing people who have developed incredible expertise in Antarctica and have spent a lot of time building relationships with the governments we need to influence, and the scientists who study Antarctica and produce useful research about the state of Antarctic conservation. So as Jim mentioned, there are a lot of different environmental issues related to Antarctic environmental protection. Protected areas, the topic of this talk today, as well as the regulation of things like fishing and tourism. We've been involved in a number of issues over the years. After the mining debate was settled, which I'll discuss in just a second, that we also moved on to the IUU toothfish crisis in the Southern Ocean. There was a seabird bycatch in the toothfish fishery. We worked on that. And so there's always something new. And I think today Antarctica is facing unique challenges that weren't really envisioned at the time when these agreements were negotiated. But we are trying to use the tools that we have available in those agreements to continue to protect Antarctica to the best of our ability today. And one of the ways we do that is trying to promote new and innovative ideas, or sometimes even just best practice from the rest of the world, because sometimes multilateral bodies are slow to catch on to what everybody else is already doing. That started with us opposing the development of a mining convention. And today, I think one of our primary things that we are doing is really heavily promoting the implementation of the 30 by 30 goal in Antarctica. Because the tools are all there to designate marine protected areas and protected areas on land as well. And now that there's a huge global push for it, there's really no reason for Antarctica not to catch up. As I alluded to, Antarctica is governed by a series of treaties. The most important that I will be mainly talking about today are the Antarctic Treaty and the Environmental Protocol. And the protocol is the agreement that we got instead of a mining convention, and it has a number of articles and provisions that are designed to ensure the highest possible level of environmental protection for the Antarctic continent. So it governs how to do environmental impact assessments. It governs protected areas. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And basically, it was a huge victory. It banned mining indefinitely. Sometimes you will hear that the treaty expires at a certain point, or the protocol expires. I am here to tell you today it does not. The ban is in place until there's a procedure for putting in place a new legal agreement if somebody wants to change the mining ban or any part of the protocol. But everybody focuses on the mining ban usually when they talk about this. It would require a new international legally binding instrument, and it would require consensus from all of the countries that were the original parties to the environmental protocol. Which is an incredibly high bar. Just as an example, if anybody's familiar with the new High Seas Treaty that was just entered into force a couple of weeks ago, that treaty process, negotiating that, and of course it's a bigger thing, that took over 20 years from start to finish. So you can imagine that something like mining in Antarctica would take a long time as well. And also there are many countries that are firmly opposed to any mining in Antarctica. So sometimes consensus can be difficult in an international system to get everybody on exactly the same page. But in this case, it might be a bonus, because all we would need is one of those original countries to say, heck no, and nothing would go forward. The other important treaty is the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or the CAMLR Convention. That's the meeting I'm attending in a couple of weeks, or in a week actually. That one it is not a fishing treaty per se. There's conservation in the title. It's not constituted as a traditional regional fisheries management organization. And it is strongly focused on the conservation of the marine environment. And sometimes it's called the Krill Convention because part of the motivation for it was concern that if the krill, which is a small crustacean that many of the species in the Southern Ocean rely on, there was concern that if the fishing of that was not managed, that there would be huge ecosystem problems. So there's a strong ecosystem and ecosystem as a whole focus in the treaty. It's not just about single species fisheries management. So the treaty parties under these agreements meet annually to talk about each agreement and how to make decisions about the various areas they have to regulate, which includes conservation, terrestrial and marine. And both of the agreements, even though the Environmental Protocol was adopted in 1991 and the CAMLR Convention was adopted in 1980, they have very good references to setting aside areas for conservation and scientific study. And so it is entirely possible to do that. And there is a pretty detailed section of the Environment Protocol on that. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I think it's pretty good for 1991, and it's still pretty robust, I think, viewed from a lens of today as well. So there are two main types of areas that you can designate as protected or conserved areas under the protocol. There's Antarctic specially protected areas, and there's Antarctic specially managed areas. And now, even though there is a treaty for the marine environment, a different treaty, and these areas can include marine areas. So I think that's in recognition of the fact that, as a penguin in Antarctica, you might not know when you're leaving the area of jurisdiction of one treaty and going to another. So sometimes you need to include some coastal and marine areas in your conservation. And I think that's a very good inclusion, because it is a little arbitrary, I think, to separate the two out. Although in international law, people like to have very clean lines between things, regardless of the scientific justification for that. Antarctic specially protected areas are designed to protect a wide range of values: environmental, scientific, historic, even aesthetic or wilderness values, and also scientific areas that are important to scientific research. I think, but the key provision in this part of the protocol is that parties shall, and as some of you are probably aware, when you say shall in international agreements like this, that has a specific and important meaning. So should is more light. It doesn't really obligate anything. Shall creates an obligation. Parties shall seek to identify within a systematic environmental geographic framework and to include in the series of Antarctic specially protected areas a range of areas, and they are enumerated in the protocol very specifically. And that includes inviolate areas, wilderness areas, areas representative of major ecosystem types, the type, locality, or known habitat of any known species, areas of particular interest to ongoing or planned scientific research, examples of outstanding geological, glaciological, or geomorphological features. So the countries that agreed this were very specific in what they wanted to see. And I think that's pretty forward thinking for the time. And especially the part about it being systematic. It shouldn't just be, oh, we saw this area and we liked it, so we're going to protect it. There needs to be some kind of overarching thought behind it. And I think that is really strong and really good language. And I think, I often tell people, we don't need to update the protocol. We don't need to update the Kamilar Convention. They have the tools we need. We just need countries to have the political will to get them agreed. And this is why, because this is pretty robust and specific language that should guide how you do Antarctic land conservation. So Antarctic specially managed areas, these are a little bit more, I won't say weaker, but, or I don't want to say weaker, but these areas are a little bit different than ASPAs. ASPAs require a permit to enter. You have to develop, very specific, rules for those kinds of, for entry and permitting into ASPAs. But ASPAs, but Antarctic specially managed areas are more about coordinating activities and reducing the possibility of cumulative environmental impacts. And so they're more about, there are certain areas in Antarctica where there's a lot going on. There's maybe a lot of scientific research, a lot of scientific stations, possibly tourism uses as well. And these areas are supposed to help parties coordinate those so that they can minimize any impacts. There are no permits required for entry, but both ASPAs and ASMAs require management plans that, after designation, need to be reviewed every 5 years. So this creates a pretty significant administrative, I guess, burden for the countries that are involved in ASPAs and ASMAs. And that is something I'll also refer back to later as part of the issue with actually putting this provision of the protocol of a systematic environmental geographic framework into implementing that in practice. And additionally, any ASMA or ASPA that does include a marine area has to consult CAML, it has to consult the other body before the marine area is designated, which can create some issues and bureaucratic red tape that maybe does not facilitate conservation. But I think the idea was you have to check and make sure that nobody's doing any, I guess, important fishing there first. So in practice, we have about 76 ASPAs. There are further 6 that were designated but have been de-designated because it's now considered that there are not, the values that they represented are not important anymore. There are 6 ASMAs and 96 historic sites and monuments. And I think from that you can tell that it's easier to do a historic site and monument than it is to do an ASPA. You don't need to have as detailed of a management plan. For example, one of the historic sites and monuments that is my favorite is number 92, which is a tractor, just a tractor that was used in the USSR and then later in the Russian scientific program. Unfortunately, parties have not exactly fulfilled their obligation to designate a systematic network of ASPAs. And in fact, in 2014, the study that the headline I've put on the screen found that the ASPA system so far was not even close to meeting the Aichi target of 10% protection and was not representative of the range of terrestrial biodiversity. Oops, and I've repeated a bullet, apologies. And in fact, one thing that is, I think, really interesting to note about Antarctica is that an incredible amount of scientific research scientific research and analysis has gone into developing something called Antarctic conservation biogeographic regions. And so we know, or ecoregions. So we know a lot about the terrestrial biodiversity. We know a lot about the ecosystems on land in Antarctica. And that would provide a really strong basis for designating a representative system of protected areas. But unfortunately, at this point, most of the areas are small. Very few of them are over 100 square kilometers, and most of them are under 5 square kilometers. So we're really not making use of the full potential of the tools that we have available to protect Antarctica's land. And, as I mentioned on the screen, a very small amount of Antarctica's ice-free area is currently protected, and even getting to 30% by 2030 at the rate that we are currently designating ASPAs would be very difficult, unless parties start looking at larger areas or looking at regional designations instead of looking at these tiny areas.
This is Jim. I want to give you a 5-minute warning.
Okay. So why are there so many challenges? Consensus is required for all decisions. You need 29 countries to agree. You've got Russia, China, the US, Australia, New Zealand, South America, Australia, Japan, Korea, all of these countries. And while I would say the vast majority of them do agree, there are 1 or 2 that are often blocking decisions. Reviewing all these management plans and developing them is time consuming. And there are efforts from these countries that are blocking to continually ask for more science from countries that are proposing these areas. More science. They question the science that is presented. They question whether it's good enough. And there's a huge burden of proof being put on countries that want to increase Antarctica's land and ocean conservation as well. And Yeah, so that is quite a problem, and that's why we've ended up with a system that is unrepresentative. There's also the challenge of tourism management. That is not done in a very systematic way. So tourists can basically, you can start a new tourist site without any kind of approval process at the treaty level. Tourism activities do require an environmental impact assessment, but that's done through a national authority, so that's not coordinated amongst all the treaty parties. And the meeting, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, is looking into developing a more comprehensive framework for the management of tourism. And something that ASOC has heavily promoted is doing a systematic conservation planning process for the regions where tourism is the most active, and that's the Antarctic Peninsula. And using ASPAs and ASMAs to help manage the tourism footprint and ensure that there is sufficient protection of Antarctica's biodiversity. So I don't really have as much time to talk about the marine aspects of it, but suffice it to say, there's also a process going on at CAMLR to develop a representative system of marine protected areas, and they've adopted 2 so far. There are 4 on the table at this meeting, including in the Antarctic Peninsula, the Weddell Sea, which is split into 2 parts, and East Antarctica. The official reasons that these MPAs have not been designated, despite CAMLR committing to do so by 2012, and it's a few years past 2012 at this point. There's a desire on the part of some countries to go back and revise the measures that are supposed to govern the development and designation of MPAs. There are, again, concerns that MPAs don't have sufficient science. Proponents of MPAs are continually being asked to provide additional scientific justifications for their MPAs. But what's really holding things up is a general rejection of protection and conservation measures, which is very similar to what's happening with land conservation. Everything, even very small areas we've seen on land are being, questioned. The scientific basis for that is questioned. And so these large marine protected areas, which are millions or hundreds of thousands of square kilometers versus the tiny ones on land, these are subject to an incredible level of scrutiny, which, interestingly enough, is not the same for fishing. So fishing gets approved every year. The science for that needed for that seems to be minimal, but a marine protected area proponent country can put forward a proposal based on hundreds of data layers and years of data analysis, and that is being rejected by 1 or 2 countries as being insufficient. So we are looking at an ecosystem or ecosystems in the Antarctic that are being stressed by a lot of things. There's a desire to increase fishing. There's an increase in tourism, increase in the scientific infrastructure footprint. And they're also being stressed out by climate change as well. But unfortunately, they are not keeping pace. The conservation is not keeping pace with that and keeping pace with what we know is effective, setting aside significant proportions of these areas. And also the discussions on the land and the sea are largely separated, despite the fact that they're not necessarily separated in an ecological or environmental sense. So these institutions both have the basis to do really great things and do, I think, what would be effective conservation, but unfortunately, right now they're falling behind. So I think the challenge for NGOs and those who support conservation is to work with the countries that are blocking and overcome these objections to ambitious conservation proposals so that we can use these really great tools that we have at our disposal.
Claire, thank you very much. That was very clear, and thank you for being so perseverant. You represent a group, a coalition of private and NGO organizations, which is exactly what the International Land Conservation Network focuses on. So your appearance here is very appropriate, and thank God you're down there in Hobart every year, fighting the good fight and doing the best that you know how to do. And we will stay in touch and try to keep you very much involved with the IUCN to the extent that we can. Our next guest is Grant Ballard. He is the Chief Science Officer, and I understand he's subbed from time to time as the interim CEO of Point Blue. He's originally from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, but joined Point Blue as a volunteer in 1991, having graduated from Cornell University as an English major. So he went where his heart was. And he's worked on a number of Point Blue projects in a number of roles since then, from California to Alaska to Antarctica. He is now their chief science officer and responsible for leadership and coordination of scientific activities. In addition to his BA in English from Cornell, he has a PhD in biological science from the University of Auckland and is an ecologist who knows very well how to evaluate climate change impacts on wildlife and human populations. He's also an expert in bioinformatics. Grant lives in the San Francisco area and works primarily from Point Blue's offices in Petaluma, California, but my understanding is he has been down to Antarctica many times to pursue his research. So Grant, welcome to the ILCN webinar. The floor is yours. Grant, are you there?
I'm muted. Hello.
There we
Thank you
go.
for
There we
thank you
go.
for the great introduction and for welcoming us so warmly. And Claire, thanks for your presentation as well. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit more and get a little bit more into the marine environment and some of the work that we've done and talk about the challenges that we're facing, that Antarctica is facing, and that conservation in Antarctica is facing. So first, introduction to Point Blue. We're a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1965 as Point Reyes Bird Observatory. So it's our 60th anniversary. Pretty excited about that. I'm sticking around. I've been with the org since 1991 when I started as a volunteer. Our annual budget this year is about 35 million. We have about 180 scientists, and generally our mission is to try to improve conservation outcomes using science, partnerships, and outreach. We've had some pretty significant conservation impacts over the 60 years. Lots of amazing people have come through Point Blue, PRBO, over that period of time. A lot of people stay a long time and make their whole career with the org. We have a presence on the Farallon Islands that's incredible. We've basically occupied that island for 24/7 since 1968. And during that time, stewarded the recovery of the largest seabird colony in the lower 48. We've been working a lot in Sierra Meadows, and we're really focused on 30 by 30 goals in the Sierra. Trying to get 30,000 acres, coincidentally, it's not 1,000 acres of meadows restored by 2030. And recently got $20 million allocated to about 60 projects to do 8,000 acres that are underway right now. We've partnered with more than 1,000 ranchers on private lands in California, improving conservation practices on over 2 million acres, and getting about $110 million of farm bill money that would have otherwise gone back to the general fund to stay in California to improve conservation outcomes on private lands. We do a lot of training of apprentices and early career scientists, more than 2,300 so far. And those folks tend to really stick with it for their careers. About 80% of them go on to do conservation science in one way or another. And with Claire and others and the amazing community we have around the Ross Sea, we helped to establish the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, working really closely with CAMLR for a really long period of time. I think it took, I don't know, I would say about 17 years or something, maybe 15 years of effort. And like Claire was saying, kind of what we would consider overkill on the amount of science that was provided. But at the time, it seemed like that. And these days, they're asking for even more. But ultimately, that was successful. And it's one of the more inspiring conservation stories that I'm aware of, resulting in the protection of 600,000 square miles of ocean habitat. And arguably the largest marine protected area in the world, still, depending on the level of protection that you use as a definition for that. So a lot of the context of the work that I do is was really well summarized by Ben Halpern et al. In 2008. This science paper was covered by basically every major news source. It was on the cover of the New York Times for a minute, um, and he has this approach to synthesizing all the impacts of human activities collectively, synthesizing across every available data set. And basically the end result was, most of the ocean is pretty messed up, unfortunately. A lot of that's because of fishing, pollution. At the time, we weren't as concerned about climate change, although it was starting to become an issue for sure. But the polar regions were found to be relatively pristine. That paper was recently updated, actually this year. And if you haven't seen that paper, you should check it out. Another Halpern paper, basically now looking at the effects of climate change and projecting into the future where the places are that are most likely to have significant problems. And end of this, basically, long story short, is that the polar regions are still very pristine relative to the rest of the planet, and very good targets for conservation because of that. So, like I said, we've been working in Antarctica, Point Blue, since 1972, largely researching the sea ice ecosystem. Uh, it's been a privilege and just an amazing experience to be able to get there as many times as I have. I've been working in ASPAs that Claire was talking about at Cape Crozier, Cape Royds, Beaufort Island, places around the Ross Sea since 1996, and I'm about to deploy for my 28th expedition. We're working to really understand how the sea ice ecosystem in Antarctica is responding to climate change, and especially through the eyes of Adelie penguins and other animals that rely on that ecosystem. I just want to make a quick note about ASPA. This is a picture of Cape Crozier and the Adelie penguins there. They're thinking about jumping in the water and are a little bit hesitant because there's leopard seals out there, and they take their time to and then all go at once to kind of minimize the risks that they face. But the terrestrial habitat is super important for them. There aren't very many ice-free locations where Adelie penguins can actually build their nests around Antarctica. And almost every single possible location is actually that's ice-free is occupied by Adelies. So they're a really good indicator of the availability of that habitat, although their populations are changing a lot. But they use a much, much larger area at sea. So it's something to bear in mind. These animals need, at Cape Crozier, they regularly go 100 kilometers out to sea and then back. So doing a 200-kilometer round trip to get back and feed their chicks. As Claire was alluding to sort of how, actually not pristine Antarctica is. There's a long history of exploitation, actually, just like everywhere else. There was, since day one, there was, exploitation of the seals and the whales. And really, thanks to the Antarctic Treaty System that Claire outlined, we have actually gotten to protections, but it's been relatively recent. So I think it's important just to remember that this is a system that's actually in recovery. And now that it's protected, it is recovering, and there's incredible success stories. I think Claire's last picture in her slide was an aggregation of an incredible number of fin whales that these sightings have become more common recently after almost complete, like 90% of the whales were removed from Antarctica. Up until about 1972, I think it was, seals were still being killed to feed sled dogs. by sort of New Zealand and other national programs. So just like a lot has changed in not that long. The International Whaling established a moratorium on whaling in 19 that went into effect in 1986. So that wasn't that long ago. And then after that, there was what Japan was calling scientific whaling. It continued until 2019, with not insignificant, from an ecological perspective, take of minke whales, particularly in the Ross Sea region. So this is I think, a really lovely projection of the Earth. It's called a Spillhouse projection. It shows sort of the importance of the ocean. And I encourage you to look into Spillhouse and the map and what their thinking was behind this. But this map in particular is showing the role of the Southern Ocean and in the global circulation. And it's basically, so the Southern Ocean is the only ocean that flows completely around the planet. So it connects all the other oceans. And it's basically like a massive roundabout for the world's water. This region is the primary engine for the deep ocean's conveyor belt. It's powered by the annual formation of Antarctic sea ice. So it basically, when seawater freezes, and there's a little bit of this happening at the North Pole too, but much more in the south. When seawater freezes, it pushes salt out, creating pockets of extremely cold, salty, and very dense water. And this then sinks. And this supports the formation of what's called Antarctic bottom water. And that sinking process is so powerful that it pulls surface water from around the globe south to replace it. So it's actually acting sort of like the heart of the global ocean, driving global circulation. And there's this current, so the blue is the deep water and the red is the surface water, and going around Antarctica at the surface level. But it's a pretty deep current. It's called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and that is a key part of the ocean flow. It's the largest, most powerful current on Earth, and it redistributes heat and carbon dioxide that's absorbed by the global ocean evenly. It basically acts as a regulator. It's an incredible thing from an ecosystem perspective, and the Earth would be extremely different if it didn't exist. And it actually came into formation about 20 million years ago. So there was an Earth before the ACC, which was a very different planet than the one we have now. I just want to highlight, this is a map of chlorophyll as taken from a space sensor, thanks to NASA. And we've got the Ross Sea highlighted here with the red arrow, showing it that as really the hotspot of the Southern Ocean in terms of production, the amount of stuff growing in the ocean. And these are mostly diatoms and Phaeocystus, basically algae. And that is like, if you imagine sort of the grass of the ocean, it's basically taking a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for us. It's a very powerful carbon sink. The entire Southern Ocean is responsible for something like 40% of the removal of human-generated carbon dioxide emissions. And the Ross Sea is a big part of that, at like 28 to 30% of that, which is the equivalent of about 10 million cars a year. And that was a conservative estimate. Unfortunately, California alone has like 36 million cars, so we got a lot of work to do. But anyway, it's important for people to recognize that a functioning ecosystem there is actually a big part of why that's happening. The fact that the krill are actually grazed by predators like whales and seabirds and stuff keeps a lot of that diatom cycle going. So we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I think it's a really important concept that basically natural systems are in fact doing a huge part of the regulation of the Earth's climate for us. I think everyone's aware that the sea ice has changed a lot in over the last 40 or 50 years. The left panel is the Arctic and the right panel is the Antarctic, and this is only up until 2012. A lot has changed since then. But the important message here is that the amount of time in the year that the sea ice is growing in the Arctic has shrunk by 3 months a year, which is like basically the removal of an entire season from that ecosystem. for an animal or a plant or anything else that relies on sea ice. That's a massive change. In Antarctica, it was not so clear what was going on at the time. We actually had some variability. The Ross Sea region was actually increasing its sea ice production period, and the peninsula was acting more like the Arctic. Now, recently, since 2016 or 17, this has actually changed, and we're seeing, unfortunately, the same pattern as we're seeing in the Arctic now. And so getting back to the Adelie penguins, and what we've been studying is basically over the long term, penguin populations around the Ross Sea region were increasing as the sea ice increased. And we know they're sea ice obligates. They've highly adapted to sea ice, but it's the mechanisms of that are part of what we study. Why do they need sea ice? What is it about sea ice? They've evolved over about 8 million years to be one of the sole inhabitants of this ecosystem from a seabird perspective, and they've been very successful. But why do they need the sea ice? And then where sea ice has disappeared, like around the peninsula, the Adelie penguins have actually declined significantly, and other penguin species are actually moving in there. So one of the things that we studied that we're currently working on is, the penguins of Ross Island. And it's an interesting study area because there's three different colonies on the island, and they're all really different sizes, and they're following different trajectories. And we've studied all kinds of things about them. Don't have time to talk about most of it, but one of the things is, of course, we count the penguins in various ways. And takeaway message here, this is a log scale or 10x scale, I guess. So basically the idea is that the largest colony, which is one of the biggest in the world at Cape Crozier, which is an ASPA that I work in, is has grown rapidly and until recently. And then when the sea ice went away, it kind of had a drop off that also was mirrored at Cape Bird, which is a medium-sized colony, about 50,000 pairs. Meanwhile, the small colony at Cape Royds has been about the same size this whole time. In fact, it's been about the same size since people first visited it in the early 20th century. So why would that be is one of the biggest questions that we're trying to answer. So getting into some of the challenges that we're facing, and this is all from work done by Chown et al. Basically, there's a bunch of change that's going on in the atmosphere that's changing. Atmospheric temperatures, wind speeds are increasing, and this is leading to ice sheet collapse, the glacial melt that you've heard about. It's basically, leading to the disappearance of what's called fast ice, which is the main habitat that emperor penguins require to exist. And so that we're very concerned about emperor penguins in the not so distant future, possibly going extinct. The ocean is changing. The ocean is also getting warmer. It's also getting fresher, which changes, of course, the dynamics of the whole ecosystem. And I mentioned how sea ice is going away. And these things probably will affect, things like krill and fish. People are still, really trying to get to the bottom of like how all the changes in the ocean chemistry and temperatures are affecting the ecosystem. But generally, scientists are alarmed. We talked about sea ice and the changes there. I think it's just important to know that it seems to have reached a tipping point as far as we can tell, about 2016, 17. Sea level is rising. So as the glaciers melt, the freshwater land ice is rushing into the water, and sea level has doubled. Sea level rise rate has doubled in the last 20 years. It's the potential for 10 to 20 feet of sea level rise this century is real, and it will severely impact Antarctica. Of course, it'll severely impact the whole planet, but it's something to think about in terms of future protection for terrestrial habitat. So this means that there will be changes in where plants can grow and increasing risk of invasive species, things that can deal with changing environment. and there are new plant species coming in. And for marine life, this means population changes and declines for mammals and birds, southward contraction of Antarctic krill, we believe, potential declines in krill and fish, and like I said, potential extinction for emperor penguins. And we've never actually had a species go extinct in Antarctica yet. So one of the mechanisms that we think is driving changes in Adelie penguins, and I just wanted to show you one aspect of the science we're doing, is thinking about where these penguins molt. And this has been overlooked for the most part because it happens at sea, on sea ice, in a time when humans are not out there to watch it for the most part. But the hypothesis is that you need a lot of sea ice for all these millions of Adelie penguins to actually get out of the water because they cannot go in the water when they're molting. So we predicted that the penguins would go to places where there is a lot of ice, or where there at least has used to be a lot of ice, and that's where they would molt. Nobody really knew exactly where they went before. And then if there were changes in ice, we would see a direct effect of the declines in ice and how many penguins came back year to year. In other words, there would be higher mortality when there was less ice. So we were able to track hundreds of penguins over a 3-year period and map out exactly where they were going and sort of form these new understanding of where of the molt areas, and the purple line is the 95% confidence interval, and then the 50% is the greenish line. So this white outline is the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, and you can see that for the 50% area for the east, what we call the eastern molt, where this is where millions of penguins are molting here, it's actually inside the Marine Protected Area, which is fantastic. However, there is this larger 95% area. So there are penguins that are hoping to molt out here that are in less protected waters. And in this case, I would say the protection would be from tourism. We want to keep tourist vessels away from molting penguins. So that's a consideration we're working on. This is what a high sea ice concentration year looked like. This is 2003, and that main molt area in the east had a lot of ice during the molt period back then. But more recently, it looks like this. There's hardly any ice. So this is a satellite image that shows basically, in white where there's any ice above 15% concentration. And you can see that there's basically nothing out there at this point. There is still ice out there, but compared to 2003, it's a really, really different ecosystem. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to switch over to krill a little bit.
You've got
Krill,
a couple of minutes, Grant. I know
yep.
you've covered a huge amount.
Got it. The Antarctic krill fishery is a really important economic factor in Southern Ocean management. It's about 250 to $900 million a year. Hard to say for sure. It's been somewhat well managed previously, and as Claire was talking about, Camelar is thought of sometimes as the sort of krill convention. Partly because krill is so important. It's the by biomass the heaviest thing on Earth of all animals, which is kind of hard to imagine. And so of course whales and birds depend on it, but also humans are harvesting it. And this map shows where it's been harvested, and this is the Antarctic Peninsula. These areas are very high areas of conflict between humans and animals. These are important biodiversity spots. Recently, unfortunately, there hasn't been a new agreement about where within this general area you are allowed to take krill. So that's not being managed. The total take is managed. So there are limits to how much people can take out of here, but where it's taken from is currently not well managed, and that's a very high concern. Another fishery is the toothfish fishery, and Claire mentioned that. ASOC worked a lot on this, and we're very concerned about this fishery. It was a relatively new fishery, started in 1997 or 1996. But the black line shows like what the allowable, or this is the total allowed catch for toothfish in the Ross Sea region. And we haven't really met that total allowable catch, which Camelar set that limit. as a precaution. So in other words, Camelar believes that this fishery is well managed. There is very little illegal fishing. In fact, maybe none. The red is illegal fishing that was happening, or unreported fishing that was happening in the earlier days, but it seems like maybe that's under control at this point. So that's generally good news. This fishery is probably worth about $200 million a year. I couldn't find the actual data on this, but anyway, we have been concerned about it because we saw some changes in the ecosystem and things that we were monitoring when that fishery kicked in, including there was a scientific study of toothfish that really changed in what they were reporting starting around the time of the fishery. This is a number of large toothfish that were taken out of the southern Ross Sea by the scientists. And you can see that they just basically started having a lot of trouble finding large fish starting around the time of the fishery. But there's no consensus, even among the scientists, that this is actually because of the fishery. We also reported that the number of Antarctic type C killer whales that eat toothfish declined fairly significantly over the period of time that the fishery has been in place. But again, no consensus that that's definitely due to the fishery, but it is concerning. So tourism is another factor that's impacting the continent. Claire mentioned it. It's just, this shows the increase over time. The pandemic slowed it down a bit. Obviously, 2021, there was almost nothing happening down there, but it really took off after the pandemic. And orange is people who just go on the cruise ship, and these are big cruise ships that if you're above, I think it's 75 passengers or something like that, or maybe it's 150 passengers there, you're not allowed to land anybody. And the blue are all the landings, people who go on smaller ships. Yep, just 2 slides now.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
We just wanted to mention pathogens. Everybody's heard of avian influenza. It's spreading. It is present in Antarctica, but it hasn't made it to most of Antarctica yet, which is great. And I'm hoping it doesn't, but we are monitoring it actively. It has the potential to just, really decimate populations, and it's highly concerning. And tourism is a factor in this because people are walking around in penguin colonies and other kinds of with other animals and potentially spreading pathogens. So that's something to be very alarmed and cautious about. But I do think the tourist industry is doing okay at regulating it, or trying to. They are making an effort. And microplastics are also present in Antarctica now. They're everywhere. Okay, I think I'll pause here because probably questions are going to come up around the last stuff. So I just want to thank you for your time and the opportunity to present.
Well, we have opened a box. I don't know if Pandora owns it or not, but a large box of challenges that you face. I will ask the first question. We still have 18 people online, so I invite everyone who's interested in asking a question to put your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to take as many as I can over the next 15 or 20 minutes. But I will ask the first one, which is, given the number of challenges you face and the difficulty you have in getting CAMLR or any other organization to help act on these challenges, how do you pick your targets, and where do you think, as an NGO or a set of NGO, a coalition of NGOs, you can be most effective going forward?
Well, I think there's 2 angles we try to go from. One, there are a number of countries in Antarctica that they're active in Antarctic governance that have a really strong conservation focus. And they've put a lot of effort into science that can be used for conservation purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not always the case, by the way. The U.S. government once told ASOC, I saw this old memo from the 80s, that the idea of a ban on mining was not negotiable. So, and then a few years later, they agreed to it. So, we've had to really work to convince all these countries that are currently conservation champions. They weren't always conservation champions, and we had to work hard to get them to that spot. So I think that's something we always try to remember as well, is that, an objection today isn't an objection forever. So one thing we try to do is we try to, shore up that support. Our relationships with delegations, the one-on-one, over the years since the 1970s that has been, I think a key factor in turning things around. As much as I would love to be able to say that, we put together all the great science that Grant and other scientists do, and we just present it and people say, oh, this is great, we'll do it. It's not really how it works, unfortunately. People are not very logical in the world. So we have to build those relationships. We've built trust, I think, now that we're, no longer hanging around outside the meeting room, but we're in the meeting room. Countries don't always agree with us and they don't always like us, but I think they trust us enough to listen to us and have a dialogue, even when we're pushing things that they think are too ambitious or unrealistic. So there's that element of it. We want to maintain these countries that have become conservation champions and have become invested in Antarctic conservation and see it as something that is valuable and worthwhile, even if it doesn't provide them, any kind of monetary benefit. They see it as something that they do, out of principle. We have to help maintain that. And it's difficult because there's so much going on in the world today, right? I mean, if you are a diplomat from a European country, you've got a lot on your mind. You've got the war in Ukraine, there's other wars, you're getting pressure from the US imposing tariffs and things like that. And, why would you spend a lot of time and money developing a proposal for a new protected area in Antarctica that's just going to be shot down or objected to? So we have to keep them up, and we have to help them understand the benefits of getting these wins. But we also have to work on the naysayers. And China and Russia have been countries that have opposed a lot of the proposals for protected areas, the ASPAs and ASMAs, as well as the marine protected areas. So we have to work on them too. And Russia's a little difficult right now, but China has agreed to has ratified or is in the process of ratifying the new High Seas Treaty. China was a key driving force behind the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So there is a way, and that is just something that we do with our Chinese colleagues. We have colleagues who work at Chinese NGOs. And we are always looking for ways to do that outreach to Chinese diplomats. We also encourage other countries to keep talking to China, because it's really a matter of, I'm not sure this is the right word, but socializing some of these ideas. China is a relative newcomer to the Antarctic Treaty System. So I think just as Australia, New Zealand, the US, other countries, when they first came in, they were thinking about the minerals part and not so much about the conservation part. I think China is looking at the fishing opportunities in the Southern Ocean. They're looking at what they might want to do in Antarctica in the future. And I think it's up to us and other countries that are supportive of conservation to make the case that conservation is not incompatible with those things, but in fact, it enables those things.
Yeah. Grant, do you want to add to that list of diplomatic tasks?
I think that the socializing is, like that Claire was wondering if that was the right word. I think it is. To me, that is exactly the thing is, through the scientific community, there's this thing we call science diplomacy. A lot of the people who are actually in Antarctica and sort of witnessing what's happening and talking to each other and running into each other at various, the gateway cities like Hobart and Christchurch and Cape Town, like they're scientists and they're going there to study stuff, all kinds of different things. And they end up talking to each other sometimes. And we're trying to get a lot more of that talking going on. And then the scientists have to be talking to the policymakers and the politicians. And that's starting to happen more. And there's new networks that are forming. But it's those conversations that actually help address that question that you asked about where, what are the priorities? I mean, any one scientist doesn't know the answer to that question, but
Right.
collectively, especially talking to policymakers and ASOC and all the NGOs, and that's we don't know what they are, so we have to tell each other. We have to have community around that, and share our sense of those priorities, and that's happening more and more now.
Well, good for you all, as I've said before, good for you for persevering. We have a question from Kazimierz Rapsky. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. How do you plan to manage tourism development? Are there procedures in place to address the tourism wave that you're facing?
Well, after many years, the Antarctic Treaty is finally looking to develop a comprehensive framework to manage tourism. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of tourism management is kind of voluntary and on a site-by-site basis. And it's also, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's not necessarily coordinated. If you're a US tourism company, you might go to the US and get a permit to do things, but that's not, and the US will review it and tell you if you can or can't do it, but that's not taking place according to any kind of comprehensive plan that's been agreed to by all the treaty countries. So they are looking at something that would be more comprehensive. And that has taken years and years to get to the place where they're even ready to talk about that. So that I think is a really positive development. And I think, quite honestly, I think they were content with the status quo until tourism numbers hit 100,000, which may not sound like a lot, but when you consider the small amount of ice-free area in Antarctica and the small amount of areas that tourists go to, which are mostly in the Antarctic Peninsula, although some in the Ross Sea, um, it is a lot of people. And it's not, say in a national park, you might have a plan like, hey, these trails are open, these trails are closed, or this area is closed during the breeding season of this animal.
Mhm.
You don't have anything like that in Antarctica. And so that is something that ASOC has pushed for a number of years to say, hey, there's systematic conservation planning processes and other kinds of processes that take place all over the world to manage or to talk about how to manage activities in an area, what areas are off limits, that kind of thing. This is pretty standard, and you really need to be doing this instead of looking at, this half a square kilometer site that maybe has a really great penguin nesting area. That's great. It's great to protect that, but you need to be looking at the region as a whole and determining what kind of conservation objectives you want to meet. And I think there is finally some openness to that that we're seeing after many years of people saying, oh no, that's too difficult. We can't do it. It's not possible. I think now some folks are saying, yeah, actually, that does make sense. Instead of going bit by bit, we should take a look at the region and figure out where should tourists be going. Do we want to allow them to open new sites? Do we want to close off the area to new sites? And so this is a lot. These are questions that are difficult for 29 countries to answer collectively, but at least the fact that they're willing to start discussing them is honestly, it might not sound like it's huge, but trust me, it's huge. So
That's great. That's great. Um, let me ask. I have two more questions online, and then I think we're going to try to wrap this up. But one is related to what you just said. What's your expectation for this next meeting? Is there any chance of making substantial progress on any one of these issues that you're wrestling with right now?
Sure. So the main thing or I think the thing that will be the most actively discussed at this meeting is the krill fishery in the region that Grant was showing on the screen, because for the first time, pretty much ever, that fishery reached its catch limit and had to be closed this year, and that has alarmed a lot of folks. Because it isn't spread out, and that means that they can concentrate the fishery in a very small area. And even though there's a lot of krill, if you're a penguin and you can only go 100 kilometers in a day, you can't just go somewhere else and where the krill is if
Right.
a krill vessel's taken it all. So um, that is something that the conservation-minded countries are very concerned about. They really don't like it. Um, and so I think that is going to drive a lot of the discussions. How do we deal with that? How do we get something better in place? And I think there is a lot of room for progress because there is unfortunately a lot of pressure to fish even more krill. And because it is a consensus-based system and everyone has to agree, those countries that want more krill are going to have to make some conservation concessions
Right.
to
Right.
get that. So
Grant, do you want to add anything to that? Do you have any near-term expectations that you think we can make progress on?
I think ASPAs are a really vital part of the system. That, and Claire described what they are. They work. People take them very seriously. It's hard to get a permit to work in one, and at least with the United States, like there's a lot of monitoring. I think it's true for all of it. I mean, from what I've seen, so we can expand ASPAs that exist. We can change the boundaries, and I think we need to. A lot of them were established, 20, 30 years ago, and things have changed. Conditions are changing. Penguin populations are expanding in some places. Um, Society is changing its understanding of sort of what's acceptable, and I think in a good direction in a lot of cases. So a lot of the original bases and research stations were built basically right in the middle of penguin colonies, for example. They should be moved, and they are movable. And as similar with tourism, I think the idea that you need to be able to, like, hug a penguin when you go to Antarctica is going out of style. So giving them more space is doable. And I think that the tourist industry is open to, they are somewhat organized. They have a International Association of Antarctic Tourism Operators that is participating in conversations with the global community, and willing to take that kind of feedback, and understand that, they are subject to, regulation under various, treaty mechanisms. So I think there's a lot of progress, a lot of conversation happening, but we need to keep on it. And I would love to see ASPA's, the area at sea around terrestrial ASPA's, broadened more generally.
Okay. So last question, well, set of questions. One is, does Camelar meet every October? Is it in Hobart? Is that the schedule?
Yeah, Camelar meets in October every year in Hobart, and then the Antarctic Treaty meeting rotates alphabetically by treaty party. So this year it was in Italy. Next year it will be in Japan. So we get a little variety. I mean, Hobart's a great town, but
Yeah.
I've been
Capital of
there 15
Tasmania.
times.
All right. So my last question, which comes from an anonymous attendee, is what can the international land conservation community, which is 2,000 practitioners plus a lot who come to our conferences, how can we help you all? How can we add value to what you're trying to do valiantly?
Um, well, at least from a very practical perspective, I mentioned in my presentation, there's I think part of the reluctance to expand ASPAs or designate more is that it's there's the monitoring requirement. I noticed there was a question about that. Yes, countries that propose ASPAs are usually required to, keep an eye on them and that kind of thing. So there is monitoring that goes on. They update the management plan. It can be a fairly long process. So I think understanding how to do larger scale land conservation in a large area would be in a larger area would be helpful. Understanding how other folks do this. Like I said, we have the scientific basis to understand what the ecology is, and therefore it would be, it's not, we don't need to get more information, or we can always use more information, but we have a basis to start and expand some of these aspects, like Grant
Right.
mentioned. We just need, I think we need some practical tools for the folks that do this work to feel like, this is not going to be all their time for the next, decade or something like that. And I don't think it has to be, but I think that is kind of how they think about it sometimes from a practical perspective. So
Right.
just learning
Good.
more about best practice, I think, and how other folks have managed areas like this.
I do want to say that we're going to have our next Global Congress in Melbourne in 2027. So
Ooh.
maybe there is some kind of a chance for you to mix with us and us to mix with
Mhm.
you and to trade some best practices Melbourne isn't Hobart, but it's not very far away. So,
Yeah, just a hop
Grant,
and jump.
yeah, it's just a short plane ride. Grant, if you want to add to the answer to the question is how can we help?
I think, lessons learned from around the world in what's working, and especially as things are changing, what's changing as we, with climate change pressures, with social evolution, um, what are you all learning about what is effective, and can it be applied to Antarctica? Sometimes Antarctica is, I mean, it's an insular community. I think we're trying to expand that and get more, more global ties, but it has tended to be sort of, you're in the tent or you're not in the tent. So, like, can we bring more people into the tent that have perspective from other situations, especially as more and more, tourists are getting there. And also the national programs are expanding. I mean, China is building more and more bases, for example. So there's a lot more people going to Antarctica. So it's important.
Well, let me say that it's been a great pleasure talking with both of you. We really appreciate the time and the effort you put into preparing your presentations. And I promise that we'll continue to keep going on this and make sure that there is more cross-pollination with the broad global civic conservation community. I think with regard to remote sensing and finance and a couple of other areas, there are a lot of things that we could all share. And I look forward to seeing if we can help make that happen. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Grant and Claire, for your presentations. Chandni et al., thank you so much for your help. And we will see you on another ILCN webinar in the near future.
Yeah,
Have a
thanks
good
for
day.
inviting us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You're
Bye,
very
everyone.
welcome. Okay.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.